They say the dead speak, if you know where to listen. But what happens when even the grave goes silent? Beneath the soaring arches of Westminster Abbey, surrounded by kings, crowned and uncrowned, queens loved and betrayed, there lies a shadow, a woman whose name once rang through courts and battlefields, now reduced to a rumor, a whisper, a maybe. Anne Neville, crowned Queen of England beside her husband, Richard III, once held the weight of a nation on her shoulders. Yet, for more than 5 centuries, her final resting place remained unmarked, unmourned, and disturbingly uncertain. No grand marble tomb, no solemn statue, no Latin inscription carved deep into cold stone, just a fading memory, buried beneath centuries of dust, politics, and royal shame. Anne was no ordinary consort. Born into one of the most powerful families in 15th century England, the Neville dynasty, she was the daughter of the infamous kingmaker, the Earl of Warwick, a man whose influence rivaled that of monarchs, a man who played chess with kings and toppled them at will. Her childhood was shaped by war and ambition. The brutal chess match known as the Wars of the Roses, where loyalty shifted like sand and crowns were taken by sword. At just 14, Anne was married off to the Prince of Wales, not the future of the Yorkist dynasty, but the only son of Queen Margaret of Anjou, the Lancastrian rival. A political move, a threat, a symbol. But barely a year later, that husband was dead, slaughtered after the Battle of Tewkesbury. And Anne, a teenage widow, became a pawn. No one wanted. She was captured, hidden, possibly imprisoned by her own brother-in-law, and quietly disappeared from public view. That should have been the end of her story. But it wasn't, because Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the youngest brother of King Edward IV, had other plans. They said he had known Anne since childhood, that he found her, fought for her, freed her from the shadows and claimed her as his wife. Though not without resistance, the battle for her hand wasn't fought on the battlefield, but in chambers and courts, in whispered threats and bitter negotiations. But in the end, he won her, and with her, a direct link to the Neville inheritance, and perhaps a queen who truly loved him. For a time, they lived quietly in the north of England, ruling with efficiency, generosity, and surprisingly peace. Together they raised a son, Edward of Middleham, and for a decade, they appeared to be that rarest of royal couples, stable, united, untouched by the madness of the crown, until the madness found them. When King Edward IV died suddenly in the spring of 1483, the entire kingdom held its breath. Richard, named Lord Protector of the young heir, Edward V, did not protect the boy. Instead, he took the throne for himself. The 2 princes vanished into the Tower of London and were never seen again. The world whispered of murder, of betrayal, of ambition cloaked in uncle's care. And on the 26th of June that year, Richard became king, and Anne became queen, crowned beside her husband in a spectacle not seen since the Norman conquest. But power came at a terrible price. The people did not forget the princes. The court did not forget Anne's ancestry. And when their only child died less than a year later, the light inside her seemed to flicker and fade. By the time tuberculosis or some other wasting illness consumed her, Anne was barely 28. Her death came on the day of an eclipse. They said it was a sign. They said it was God's judgment. They said Richard had poisoned her to marry someone younger, his niece, Elizabeth of York. The rumors rotted faster than her body. And though Richard denied them publicly, sobbing at her funeral and swearing before nobles that he had loved his wife with all the sorrow a man could carry, no one truly believed him. Or maybe they didn't care to. And then came Bosworth. Richard fell. The Tudors rose. And with them came silence. No monument was ever raised for Anne Neville. No tombstone carved. No royal effort to mark her place among the kings and queens of England. Her memory was swept away with the Yorkist cause, reduced to little more than a name attached to a villain's story. But she did not vanish completely. In the year 1866, during renovations in the abbey, a heavy lead coffin was discovered near the high altar, exactly where some records suggested Anne had been buried. There was no name etched upon it, no heraldic sign, just a silent, sealed sarcophagus, untouched for nearly 400 years. Some believed it to be Anne of Cleves, the discarded wife of Henry VIII. Others whispered, "It is her, the forgotten queen, still dressed in royal robes, still crowned, still waiting." No one dared to open it. And perhaps that is why she has remained preserved, while other coffins were pried open, disturbed, desecrated, in the name of Victorian curiosity. This one was left alone. And so it may be that Anne Neville, embalmed and wrapped in cerecloth, still lies beneath Westminster Abbey, her body intact, her face unchanged, a ghost, preserved by history's neglect. Today, a small brass plate exists on the wall of the South Ambulatory, not far from the supposed site of her grave. It reads that Anne Neville was beautiful, gracious, and buried nearby. But it is only a guess, a memorial, a gesture. Her true resting place remains a secret, a silence, a shame. She is the queen with no tomb, the wife of a king cursed by power, the mother of a lost heir. And if you walk through Westminster Abbey and pause by the southern sanctuary, you may feel it, the weight of a life erased, not by time, but by the choices of men who found her inconvenient. And still she waits. She was born into a world of velvet and daggers, where alliances were forged, not in love but in war. And daughters were weighed not by their laughter, but by their worth to the crown. Anne Neville came into the world on the 11th of June, in the year 1456. Within the thick walls of Warwick Castle, a place more fortress than home, where whispers of kings and claims echoed through its cold stone halls long before she took her first breath. Her father, Richard Neville, known across the realm not simply as the Earl of Warwick, but as the Kingmaker, did not raise daughters. He crafted pawns. Anne and her older sister, Isabel, grew up under the gaze of a man who saw monarchs as clay, to be molded and shattered at will. To be born a Neville in those years of English fire and blood was to carry both privilege and peril, for theirs was a house that dared to bend the crown. The Wars of the Roses had not just split a country, it had ripped apart the soul of the monarchy, dividing the blood of Lancaster and York into a tangle of ambition, betrayal, and battlefield justice. Anne grew up hearing of men slaughtered for a rose red or white, and of queens who wielded steel behind silken gloves. Her mother, Anne Beauchamp, came from the Beauchamp inheritance, which only fed the furnace of Neville ambition. As the second daughter, Anne should have been spared the harshest expectations. But in a world where the line between duchess and hostage was as thin as parchment, no girl was truly safe. By the age of 13, Anne understood that smiles meant strategy. Silence was safer than sincerity. And that peace, true peace, was a myth written by monks, not mothers. Then the king changed everything. Edward IV young, bold, and Yorkist took the throne with the help of Anne's father. And for a time, Warwick was the shadow behind the sun. But the marriage of Edward to Elizabeth Woodville, a widow from a minor noble house, shattered the old noble order and enraged Warwick beyond repair. He had planned to marry the king to a French princess, to bind England to foreign power, to continue his puppet master reign. But Edward chose love or lust, and in doing so, cut the strings. What followed was not merely political defiance but a slow-burning vengeance. Warwick turned his back on the Yorkist king he had placed on the throne, and in an act of betrayal that stunned England, he allied with the very house he had sworn to destroy. Lancaster, Queen Margaret of Anjou, fierce, French, and still burning with the fury of her husband's deposition, accepted Warwick's offer with cautious eyes. And to seal their uneasy alliance, they demanded blood, not the spilling of it, but the binding of it, a marriage. Anne, just 14, was promised to Margaret's only son, Edward of Westminster, the Prince of Wales, a boy raised on exile and hatred. It was a union carved from necessity, not affection. The two children, for that, is what they were, met in Angers Cathedral in France in December of 1470. The ceremony was brief. The implications, massive. Anne, daughter of the Kingmaker, had now become Princess of Wales, consort to the Lancastrian heir, and with that, she became a threat. But fate or England did not allow the marriage to last well. Within 4 months, her father Warwick was dead, cut down at the Battle of Barnet in a brutal Yorkist resurgence. The alliance he had stitched together with such fury unraveled in hours. A month later, her husband Edward was slain in the chaos of the Battle of Tewkesbury. Some said he died on the field. Others whispered that he was captured and executed after surrendering. The truth was buried beneath the weight of victory. What remained was Anne, 14 years old, a widow, a political liability, and worst of all, an orphan, captured by Yorkist forces. Anne became something between a hostage and a ghost. Her mother-in-law, Margaret of Anjou, was dragged to the Tower. The House of Lancaster had collapsed, and Anne stood at its center, not as a survivor, but as a reminder of a war that had devoured everyone she had ever known. Most girls her age would have returned to their family. Anne could not. Her father was dead. Her mother was declared legally dead, her inheritance divided between those more powerful. Her sister Isabel had married George, Duke of Clarence, brother to King Edward and Richard, and it was to George's household that Anne was taken, not as kin, but as threat. George did not want Anne to marry again, not out of brotherly affection, but because he feared she would claim her share of the Neville inheritance, which now lined his own coffers through Isabel. It is said that Anne was hidden away, perhaps even disguised as a servant in his house, reduced to obscurity, erased. If not for Richard, she may have vanished completely. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, younger brother to the king, and now a rising force, had spent his youth under Warwick's patronage. He had known Anne since childhood, perhaps admired her, perhaps more. What we do know is that Richard sought her out. He fought to remove her from Clarence's hold, challenging his own brother's grip on her future. The legal battle was fierce. Clarence accused Richard of using Anne to expand his power. Richard insisted he merely sought what was right. In the end, Richard prevailed. Anne was freed, not just from her brother-in-law's household, but from invisibility. At 16, she married Richard, and the two began a life together in the north, far from court, far from the capital, far from those who once weighed her worth in gold and land. In Yorkshire, Anne became the Duchess of Gloucester. She and Richard resided at Middleham Castle, a place of high towers and quiet mist, where the past could not reach them so easily. It was there, perhaps in late 1473 or early 1474, that Anne gave birth to a son, Edward of Middleham, a child she had not been allowed to have with her first husband, a child who belonged not to Lancaster or York, but to her and Richard alone. For nearly a decade, they lived in what many chroniclers call peace. Their household was known for its discipline, et devotion, its strange, almost old-fashioned loyalty. Anne attended church. She cared for her son. Richard governed well. There were no scandals, no affairs, no rumors of cruelty. It was as if, in the north, they had escaped the poison of politics. But in England, peace is only a pause. The death of King Edward in 1483 shattered everything. The boy who was to be King Edward V never wore his crown. Richard claimed his brother's marriage had been invalid, declared the children bastards, and took the throne for himself. The world whispered betrayal. Anne, now 27, was crowned Queen of England beside Richard, becoming the first queen consort in centuries to be crowned with her husband. And yet, the girl who had once been hidden in the corner of her brother-in-law's house now stood beside a man many believed had murdered his nephews. She should have felt triumphant, but instead, she stood alone. Her only ally, her son, would die within a year. Her name would be drowned beneath scandal, and her body, when it finally gave in to grief and illness, would be laid to rest in a grave no one would mark, in a vault no one would protect, in a silence no one would break. The girl no one wanted to save had become the queen no one wanted to remember. She was not meant to be found, not meant to be remembered, let alone desired. And yet, in the shadows of Warwick's ambition and Clarence's greed, Anne Neville was not forgotten by one man, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, youngest brother to King Edward IV. Raised in war, hardened by survival, remembered her face, remembered the girl hidden in the corner of her sister's household, and remembered the softness behind the bruises of a family that devoured its own daughters. When others saw a legal threat wrapped in mourning black, Richard saw something else, entirely, a future, perhaps, or redemption, for sins not yet named. George, Duke of Clarence, did not intend to share. Anne was, to him, an inheritance in human form, a conduit to wealth he already believed was his by marriage to her sister, Isabel. With Anne remarrying, the great Neville estate might fracture, and Clarence, ever calculating, would not tolerate division. So he did what power often does. When threatened, he tried to disappear her, locked away, perhaps cloaked in a servant's apron. She vanished from public sight. Whispers said she scrubbed floors in her own bloodline's house. A ghost in velvet reduced to silence. But Richard sought her anyway. The accounts vary. Some say he found her dressed as a kitchen maid in her sister's household and led her out like a knight in a morality tale, quiet and sure. Others say there was no disguise, no resque, just political chess played in smoke-filled rooms, where her name was the wager, whatever the truth. What matters is this: Richard fought for Anne when others buried her. In a court where alliances were transient and love was a currency no longer minted, he pursued not simply a title, but a woman scarred by exile, and stripped of choice. The king had to intervene. Edward IV, weary of his brother's endless games, finally ordered that the dispute be settled, and Anne, daughter of Warwick, the kingmaker, widow of the Lancastrian heir, and political pariah turned pawn, was permitted to marry the man who had risked open conflict for her hand. In the year 1472, Anne Neville became Duchess of Gloucester, and for a fleeting moment, something close to peace settled over her life. They lived in the north, where Richard governed with a firm but notably fair hand. Unlike many nobles of the day, Richard did not bleed the land for coin. He took seriously the grievances of the people, issued judgments with surprising empathy, and surrounded himself with loyal retainers rather than scheming opportunists. It was in Middleham Castle, cold, stone-heavy, and remote, that Anne and Richard built their world. Far from the rod of court, she gave birth to their only son, Edward of Middleham. And for the first time, she was not merely a duchess or a vessel of alliance, but a mother, and perhaps even content. Chroniclers, often blind to women unless they wept or sinned, describe this period in Anne's life with rare gentleness. She was devout, they said, gracious, a patron of the poor. Her household ran smoothly, her servants well treated, her presence dignified but unpretentious. Richard, though feared by his enemies, appeared devoted to her in private. There were no mistresses, no courtly scandals trailing behind his cloak. For nearly a decade, the couple held fast in a world built on betrayal, and the child between them delicate, often ill, but adored, was their hope against the chaos outside their stone walls. But nothing in England stayed still for long. In the spring of 1483, everything cracked. King Edward IV died suddenly. His heir, Edward V, was a boy of 12. And into this void stepped Richard, named Lord Protector by his brother's final will. For a time, it seemed he might simply guard the throne for his nephew, shielding the boy from the greedy Woodville clan who now dominated the court. But guardianship has a way of becoming power, and power, once tasted, rarely relinquishes its hold. Within weeks, Richard had moved swiftly and ruthlessly. The young king and his brother were lodged in the Tower of London, ostensibly for their protection. Their maternal relatives were arrested. Parliament declared that Edward IV's marriage had been illegitimate, making the prince's bastards unfit to inherit. And on the 26th of June, Richard was declared king, not regent, not steward, but monarch in his own right. Anne was now queen. On the 6th of July, she stood beside her husband in Westminster Abbey and was crowned Queen of England, the first woman to share a coronation with her husband since the Norman conquest. Draped in cloth of gold, anointed with holy oil, crowned with heavy steel and sapphire, she bore the weight of empire not as a victor, but as a survivor. Behind the chants of God, save the Queen, loomed questions that would never leave her shadow. Where were the princes? What had Richard done? There is no record of Anne speaking publicly about the missing boys. But she did not smile much after that day. Her son, Edward of Middleham, was created Prince of Wales, heir to a throne soaked in suspicion. But the boy was frail, always had been, and despite the best efforts of physicians, prayers, and pilgrimages, he did not survive the following spring. In April of 1484, the young prince died. He was not yet 11 years old. The loss shattered Anne. Chroniclers described her wasting away, her health failing in a cascade of grief and quiet despair. She was not a woman who screamed. She simply faded. Rumors began to spread like mildew on old stone. That Richard, desperate for an heir, had grown cold. That he now looked to marry someone younger. That he had fixed his gaze on Elizabeth of York, his own niece. The idea disgusted some, intrigued others. There is little proof that such a marriage was ever seriously considered. But truth mattered less than perception. The court whispered. The people speculated. Anne, once hidden to preserve her brother-in-law's fortune, was now invisible. For another reason, she was dying. On the 16th of March, 1485, Anne Neville, Queen of England, died at the age of 28. The sky darkened. An eclipse passed over London that day, and many saw it as an omen divine judgment against Richard's reign. Or perhaps a final act of mourning from the heavens themselves. Her death was sudden, though not unexpected. Tuberculosis. Most believed. Others whispered poison. That her husband had grown impatient. That he had cleared the path to wed Elizabeth and bind York and Lancaster through scandal. Richard denied it with fury. He wept openly at her funeral, spoke publicly of his sorrow, swore that the thought of marrying his niece had never crossed his mind. But by then, the stain could not be scrubbed clean. The court had turned. The people watched from shadows. The boy king and his brother had never reappeared. And Anne, the quiet queen, slipped beneath the earth with no monument, no statue, no voice. In the silence that followed, her ring was passed from hand to hand, sold and resold, a relic of a queen no one dared to defend, and the throne Richard had seized, the throne Anne had grieved upon, and the throne their son would never inherit, was cracking beneath their feet. They had vanished not in a storm, not in a blaze, but in silence. That was the horror of it. The boys were last seen in the Tower of London. Two fragile figures behind stone walls meant to protect, not consume. Edward V, 12 years old, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, barely 10, lodged there under the pretense of safety, held by their uncle, who had sworn loyalty to their names, their rights, their blood. But then came the declarations that their parents' marriage had been unlawful, their births illegitimate, their claim to the throne extinguished by parchment and parliament. What followed was a silence so complete, it still haunts English history. The doors of the tower closed, and the boys were never seen again. Anne must have known, not the details. Perhaps not the blade or the suffocation or the smothering of pillows in the night. But she would have known the truth that lingers behind every royal act. Power demands sacrifice, and innocence dies quickest. Whether she sat beside Richard and listened as his council debated the fate of the princes, or whether she was kept at distance, cloaked in ritual and robes, the effect was the same. The day her husband took the throne, the weight of the missing boys settled on her shoulders as surely as her golden crown. She had lost before. Lost a husband at 15. Lost a father in betrayal. Lost freedom to her own family. But this was different. The realm had turned cold. Her coronation had been a spectacle. Jewels, incense, trumpets, echoing through Westminster. But behind the grandeur was a bitterness that could not be buried in banners. The people murmured. Some wept for the princes. Some cheered for a stronger king. Most just watched, uncertain whether the man who ruled now had protected his nephews or destroyed them. In private, Anne grew quieter. Hair letters, few as they were, became more pious, more resigned. She turned inward to prayer, to her household, to the one person she had left untouched by the war, her son. Edward of Middleham was not the image of a healthy heir. Thin, pale, often confined to his chambers, the boy carried the hopes of a dynasty on his small, curved spine. He had been born in peace before the throne, before the shadows in the north. In Middleham Castle, surrounded by servants who called him gentle and kind, he was raised with care. Far from London, far from the blood-soaked courts. But after Anne and Richard became king and queen, the boy was brought forward, made Prince of Wales, presented to the realm as the future. They needed to believe in something. A child born of Richard's household, untouched by the scandals of his brother's reign, free of the Woodville taint, clean enough to wash away the Tower's shame. Edward was that symbol, fragile, yes, but still unbroken. And so they paraded him, offered prayers, held masses, and whispered of coronations to come. But no ritual could strengthen his lungs. No bishop's blessing could shield his heart. In the early spring of 1484, not even a year after Richard seized the throne, Anne's only son collapsed. The boy was taken ill suddenly. Though some said the signs had been there for weeks, others believed the stress of royal life, the sharp turn from quiet Yorkshire to the poisoned air of London, had worn his body thin. Chroniclers do not agree on how he died, only that he did, and that Anne, upon hearing the news, collapsed as well. Her grief was not theatrical. There are no records of her tearing her garments, no tales of her screaming in the halls. Instead, she retreated. Her face paled, her body withered. She stopped appearing in public. Those closest to her began to write of an illness. But everyone knew that what consumed her was not fever or cough. It was loss. She had nothing left. Her marriage, though still formally intact, changed. Richard, devastated by the death of his only heir, threw himself into governance, into the repair of a kingdom that trembled beneath his feet. But there were cracks he could not seal. With Edward dead, there was no clear line of succession, no Yorkist future. The Tudor threat, once a flickering match, now grew into flame. Henry Tudor, exiled in Brittany, bastard to some, heir to others, watched with hungry eyes. And then the rumors began that Richard would seek to marry again, that he would turn his attention to Elizabeth of York, daughter of the very king he had dethroned, the sister to the vanished princes, his own niece. The idea horrified many, even in a court desensitized to incest and intrigue. But others saw strategy. A marriage to Elizabeth would bind York and Lancaster, would unite the two Roses, and perhaps secure Richard's throne. Whether he ever truly intended to pursue her is lost to time. What we do know is this: Anne heard the whispers. She lived within them, and each one carved deeper into the shell that grief had made of her. By the winter of that same year, Anne was visibly ill, thin, frail, walking only with assistance. She was no longer the queen of coronation portraits. She was shadow and sorrow. A woman undone not by war, but by its quiet aftermath. The royal physicians could do nothing. Her ladies spoke only in murmurs. The court began to prepare not for her recovery, but for what came after. She died on the 16th of March, 1485. She was 28 years old. It was the day of an eclipse. They say the sky darkened in the middle of the afternoon, that London fell into an eerie twilight as the Queen took her final breath. Some saw it as divine judgment, others as a sign of the realm's doom. The timing was too perfect, too ominous, and the rumors already circling bloomed into poison. They said Richard had hastened her death, that he had grown tired of her sickness, that he needed her gone to claim a younger bride, that the eclipse was proof of guilt, not grief. But Richard, to his credit, did not hide. He attended her funeral, wept openly, spoke words that no one dared transcribe, but that echoed in chamber memory that he had never loved more, never regretted more, never grieved so bitterly. Whether it was truth or performance no longer matters. The pain looked real enough. She was buried, quietly, within Westminster Abbey, not in a grand tomb, not beneath an angel's gaze. No statue, no carved epitaph, no queenly effigy to stand the centuries. Just a grave, somewhere near the south side of the sanctuary. Some said it lay by the door to Edward the Confessor's chapel, the holiest ground in the abbey. Others weren't sure. Over time, the memory of her burial faded. Maps lost her, records smudged her name, and eventually, Anne Neville, Queen of England, daughter of the Kingmaker, mother of a dead prince, became what she had always feared. Forgotten. The princes remained missing. Her son remained unburied in legend, and the crown she had once worn, so heavy, so cold, now balanced on her husband's head like a blade. And soon, even that would fall. It is one thing to wear a crown, it is another to carry it. And when the boy died, the crown that once sat proudly on the head of Richard III began to feel less like gold and more like iron cold, sharp, and rusting from within. Edward of Middleham had been his only son, his only heir, the last link to a future that might have justified the past. The death of the child shattered Anne, but it also carved something deep into Richard, not just grief, but the slow erosion of purpose. He had taken the throne. Yes, he had defended his claim. But for whom now did he hold it? The court tried to move forward, as courts always do, but the rhythm was broken, with the queen sickly and silent, with no prince to parade, and with the whispers of betrayal staining every corridor. Richard's court became a haunted thing, polished, but hollow. He pressed on with reforms, reorganized laws, ensured food for the poor. I tried to clean up the mess his predecessors had made. But the people remembered the tower. They remembered the vanished boys. And even when Richard spoke of justice, they heard echoes of absence. And then came the boy with the red dragon, Henry Tudor, exiled across the sea, born of the bastard branch of Lancaster, half Welsh, untested in war, but seasoned in survival, watched England decay from afar, and decided the time had come to return. With Anne dead and Edward buried, Richard looked more like a usurper than a father, more tyrant than king. The Tudor claim, once a joke, whispered behind goblets, now bloomed with danger. Foreign money fueled Henry's cause. Discontented nobles opened their gates, and across the channel, sails began to unfurl like the wings of vultures. Richard knew what was coming. He had studied battle since boyhood. He had survived the Wars of the Roses, not by accident but by skill. He understood the map of England, as a general does not in borders, but in bloodlines and betrayals. He prepared, rode north, gathered what forces he could. But time, like loyalty, was running thin. Too many had turned. Too many had waited for his crown to crack. It was late summer when they met the final gamble of a kingdom collapsing under the weight of its own ghosts. Bosworth. The fields rolled gently in the August heat. Quiet now. But waiting. Richard came with banners raised. Horsemen armored. Loyalists beside him. He still wore the white boar, his symbol, as if daring fate to touch him. Henry came smaller. Leaner. Not even yet a king in name. But burning with the ambition of one born beneath centuries of other men's mistakes. His army was a patchwork of fortune seekers. Old Lancastrian remnants. And disloyal Yorkists who had grown tired of silence. The morning of battle, Richard was said to have heard mass early. Alone. No queen to bid him farewell. No son to ride at his side. Just steel and the sound of hooves. Chroniclers would later claim he rode into the fray like a lion. Not hiding behind his men, but leading them head lowered. Swords drawn. Mouth set with something close to hunger. He saw Henry. He charged, not from a distance, but directly. In those moments, Richard was no longer king. No longer rumor or shadow, but a warrior. He killed Henry's standard-bearer with his own hands. He cut through the enemy's line. He came within a sword's length of victory. And then it slipped. The Stanleys, a powerful family who had pretended loyalty, turned. Their men, fresh and unbloodied, slammed into Richard's flank. Surrounded. The king fought on foot. Blade flashing. One chronicler wrote that his crown was struck from his helmet as he fell. Another said he was hacked from his horse. Screaming in defiance. Refusing to flee. No one offered surrender. No one took prisoners. Richard was killed there. On English soil. With mud on his boots and no prayer on his lips. The last king of the Plantagenet line. The last English king to die in battle. His body, battered and stripped, was slung over a horse and paraded through the streets. The crown, the one Anne had watched placed upon his head just 2 summers before, was handed to Henry Tudor. A new king was born. A new name written. A new dynasty forged in blood. But what became of Richard's body after the shouting stopped is a story England tried to forget. Buried without ceremony in the grey ruins of Greyfriars Priory. His grave unmarked. His bones mingled with dust and silence. No monument. No carved stone, like Anne. Like Edward. He vanished, not into myth, but into the indifference of victors. And so the family that had clung to thrones, who had ruled with cunning and cruelty and conviction, passed into legend, not with glory, but with nothing. A mother buried without a tomb. A son remembered only by a name carved in sorrow. A father left to rot beneath a forgotten churchyard. The Tudors rewrote everything. Richard became a villain. A monster twisted by ambition. Made deformed in body and soul by playwrights who never saw his face. Anne was erased almost entirely. Reduced to a footnote. Their son was never given a rightful burial. And the tower remained still silent. Still watching. The final monument to children who never grew old. And yet, something remains. In quiet corners of libraries. In the cracks of abbey stones. In the breath between church bells. You can still feel them, the family that was. The boy who died too soon. The queen who faded before the crown warmed her head. The king who charged alone. Not for power, but for a name that could not be saved. The crown did not slip in a moment. It eroded. With each death. Each silence. Each choice not made, or truth not spoken. It was not ripped from Richard's head. It was dropped, unnoticed, into the mud of Bosworth. already too heavy to carry. And when the sun set that day, it set on more than a battle. It set on a line, on a story, on a dynasty that had buried itself. In the centuries that followed Bosworth, the names of kings echoed through history's great halls. Henry, Elizabeth, James, Charles, their tombs etched in marble, guarded by angels of stone. Flowers laid gently on anniversaries. No one forgets. But beneath those same vaulted ceilings, in the silence of sacred ground, there lay a queen whose body was never properly mourned, whose death was eclipsed by rumor, and whose grave was allowed to vanish into dust. Anne Neville, once crowned beside her husband, in a ceremony watched by thousands, had slipped not just from power, but from memory, and when she died young, broken, and forgotten, the earth was not kind enough to remember where she lay. They buried her inside Westminster Abbey. That much we know. The records, faint and fragmented, speak of a grave somewhere near the southern side of the sanctuary, of close to the door that opens toward the chapel of Edward the Confessor, the holiest space in the entire abbey, a place where only the most honored were laid to rest. But there was no tomb carved for Anne, no statue raised, no royal inscription, nothing that marked her place among queens. Her funeral, though given due honor by her grieving husband, was not followed by permanence. No monument was ever erected, and no stone bore her name. And so, for 5 centuries, she remained a mystery wrapped in a coffin no one could quite find. While other monarchs were entombed in grand vaults, visited by pilgrims and historians alike, Anne's resting place was swallowed by time, renovations, and the steady forgetting that comes to those who no longer serve a dynasty's narrative. The Tudors, who had built their throne upon the ashes of Anne's family, had no reason to preserve her legacy. She had died before they rose. And worse, she had once stood beside the man who would have kept them from power. And so Anne's memory was not destroyed, simply allowed to decay. But the earth remembers what men forget. In the year 1866, during repair works in Westminster Abbey, laborers digging south of the high altar stumbled upon something unexpected, a lead coffin, heavy and ancient, buried alone in an unmarked grave. There were no inscriptions, no cross, no crest, but the location matched old records. The age of the burial seemed correct, and whispers began to stir. Could this be Anne Neville? Could the queen who had vanished from sight finally be found? The excitement was brief, clouded by confusion. Some claimed the coffin belonged to Anne of Cleves, the 4th wife of Henry VIII, who was also buried nearby. Her grave, too, was modest, and the names had tangled over centuries, like vines left to grow wild. The abbey's keepers made no firm declaration, and so the coffin remained unopened. Its occupants inconfirmed, its identity suspended in shadow. Perhaps that uncertainty saved her. During the Victorian era, fascination with the dead ran high. Coffins were often opened. Royal bones were examined, measured, displayed, poked and prodded in the name of curiosity masquerading as science. Tombs were disturbed, vaults desecrated, but the lead coffin found in 1866, whether through reverence, oversight, or a certain holy fear, was left sealed. And so, unlike many of her peers, Anne Neville may still rest undisturbed. And if she does, what might remain? Royal burial customs of the 15th century were precise. Bodies were embalmed, wrapped in layers of cerecloth, soaked in wax and resin, then placed in wooden coffins encased in lead. The combination, under the right conditions, could preserve the skin, the hair, even the softness of features, long thought, lost to rot. And Anne, buried in consecrated ground beneath the abbey's stone belly, would have had all the right conditions. If that coffin is hers, if no knife has ever broken its seal, then, inside, might still lie the outline of a face, the same face Richard once looked upon in candlelight. The same face painted into portraits, now lost to fire, and forgetting, they say she was beautiful. That's what the plaque placed much later. In 1960, claims that Anne was seemly, amiable, and beauteous, but no image of her remains. No statue bears her likeness. No painting survived the centuries. Even her memorial is not a tomb, but a shield on a wall, a token gesture affixed to stone centuries too late, a symbolic nod to a queen the abbey itself once failed to protect, and still, she waits, somewhere beneath the flagstones walked over by tourists and mourners alike. Somewhere beneath the breathless hymns and the flickering candles, her body or what remains of it lies wrapped in silence. Perhaps she wears her coronation robe still, the gold now dulled with age, the silk stiff from centuries of stillness. Perhaps a thin crown encircles her head. Perhaps her hands, once held in Richard's at the altar, are crossed over her chest, holding nothing but time. It is possible, but no one knows. And no one, it seems, dares to find out. In a way, Anne Neville has disappeared twice, once from history, and once from her own grave. She was queen, and then she was not. She was buried, and then she was lost. And even when she was found, possibly she was never truly restored. There is no state occasion to honor her, no day marked by wreaths or bells. She exists now, only in fragments, in footnotes, in the cold guesswork of archivists and stonecutters, but her story lingers. In every tale of women whose lives were shaped by others' wars, in every whisper of queens who wore the crown, but never the power, in every mention of a royal name, erased by the victor's pen, Anne Neville waits, not as a ghost, not quite, but as a question no one has answered. Who decides who is remembered? Who chooses which bones are worth naming for Anne? There was no choice. Her love was real. Perhaps. Her pain certainly was, but the world moved on. And the ground above her shifted, and in the end, all that remained was a sealed coffin and a plaque that might point to the wrong place. But maybe that's the point. Maybe Anne Neville, in death, found what eluded her in life, a space untouched by ambition, by court, by the terrible weight of being someone else's instrument. Maybe the silence she now keeps is her own, and maybe, in the stillness beneath Westminster, the queen who vanished has finally, after so many centuries, found rest. In the heart of Westminster Abbey, where kings lie entombed beneath canopies of carved stone and Latin prayers echo across centuries. One queen sleeps without a name. No sculpted likeness watches over her. No effigy reclines in eternal grace. No chiseled epitaph tells the weary pilgrim who lies beneath their feet. Just air. Just echoes. Just stone that looks like any other blank. Silent. Indifferent. Anne Neville was not buried like a queen. She was laid into the ground like a secret. The women who came after her, queens, who bore sons, who ruled in their own right, who died with dynasties, still clinging to their names, were given alabaster and gold, statues and Latin scrolls, monuments that stretch upward like fingers trying to reach something divine. But Anne, who had worn the same crown, who had walked the same aisle to be anointed by holy oil, was given nothing, not even a single line carved in stone, not even her name. There is no clear record of why, no letter explaining the omission, no royal command to leave her place unmarked. But the reason does not need to be written, it is as loud as the history that followed. She had died before her husband lost the throne. She was part of a story the victors wished to forget. And in England, as in all kingdoms, history is not written by the vanquished, and yet, silence can be heavier than stone. There were those who remembered her. In whispers and fragments, monks noted her name in burial rolls. A record from 1530 placed her near the door to St. Edward's Chapel's sacred ground, where saints and kings sleep in uneasy fellowship. But no one came to tend the grave. No candle was kept burning. No heraldic crest was mounted in mourning. Her tomb, if it had ever been planned, was never built. Richard had died months after her. There was no one left to care. And so the queen who had stood beside the last Yorkist king who had worn the crown not just in ritual but in sorrow, disappeared. Centuries passed. Stone shifted. Walls were rebuilt. Monarchs came and went. Marble was laid for others. The abbey transformed from a holy sanctuary to a national monument, a stage for coronations, funerals, and gilded pageants of state. And beneath it all, Anne waited, unnamed. She became a footnote in history books, mentioned only as Richard's wife, occasionally confused with Anne of Cleves, or ignored altogether. Her story was not scandalous enough for ballads, her death too quiet for legends, and so she lingered in the margins, not erased, but unread. Then came the Shield. In 1960, more than 470 years after her death, a memorial was installed on a wall near where she was believed to be buried. It was not a tomb, not even a grave marker, just a small enameled shield of arms, bearing her family's crest and a brass plaque with soft, uncertain words, a description of her character, not her deeds. It read that she was seemly, amiable, and beauteous, and that she had died young, and was laid to rest nearby. But even that plaque was based on speculation. No one could say with certainty that it pointed to the right place. Even her memorial, the only one she had, might be wrong. It was not grandeur. It was an apology. And though the abbey now lists her among the royal dead, her name still feels like it's whispered through gritted teeth. A reluctant inclusion in a hall that had once refused to remember her. But what might that epitaph have said? Had someone carved it? Not just her name, not just the dates, but the story beneath them. Here lies Anne Neville, Queen of England, daughter of a man who made kings and paid the price, widow of a prince whose crown was made of smoke, wife to a king who lost more than he ever stole, of mother to a child who died before he could carry the weight of two houses. She was born into war and died in eclipse. She was loved. Perhaps she was used. Certainly, she did not rule, but she reigned, and in the end, she vanished not by her own will, but by the silence of those who feared her memory more than her life. There are other queens with no tomb. Of course, other women whose names have been softened by time, but Anne's absence is sharper, because it was deliberate. The Tudors had no use for her. The church did not fight to keep her visible, and even those who came centuries later hesitated to say her name too loudly, as if it might summon something uncomfortable. A reminder that not all power is honorable, that not all queens are remembered because they mattered, but because they served a narrative. And yet, Anne's silence has become her defiance. Because though they left her stone uncarved, though they buried her name beneath 6 feet of forgetting, she has not truly disappeared. She lingers in every theory about Richard's motives, in every debate over the princes in the tower, in every excavation of royal coffins and speculation over who lies where. Her absence has weight. Her erasure has presence. And in that strange, quiet way, she has become more haunting than queens, with monuments twice as tall. She is the space between words, the shadow behind the crown, the pause in the story that will not resolve. And so, perhaps it is fitting that no one carved her stone, that no one wrote the epitaph, because the silence she left behind is louder than anything they could have said. It speaks of forgotten women and lost sons, of loyalty unrewarded, of crowns won by cunning and lost to time. It speaks of all the queens who knelt at the altar, not knowing that history would wipe away their footprints the moment they turned their back. Anne Neville was not a warrior, not a schemer, not a ruler in her own right. But she was there, at the center of it, when York fell, when Richard broke, when the world changed. She saw it all, and she kept the silence. It was never supposed to be found. That's how it felt. As if the earth itself had conspired to hold its secret not out of malice, not even out of reverence, but simply because some stories are meant to remain beneath the stone. For centuries, Anne Neville's name had been spoken only in footnotes and family trees, her grave marked by nothing more than a whisper. And yet one day, long after her body had turned to silence and dust, the abbey stirred, and the dead queen came close, so very close to being seen again. It happened in the year 1866. Westminster Abbey, by then, had become more than a church. It was a shrine to empire, a monument to memory, and a mausoleum for the worthy. It had also become, in the fashion of the Victorians, an object of curiosity. Restoration was underway. The floor near the high altar was being lifted, stones carefully pried loose, old dust spilling into the air like the breath of ghosts. The workers were not looking for her. They had no reason to expect her. But history does not ask permission when it rises. Beneath the flagstones on the southern side of the sanctuary near the path that leads toward Edward the Confessor's chapel, they found it. A coffin. Heavy. Lead. Sealed. There was no name etched upon it. No royal crest. No Latin cross or worn inscription. Just the dead weight of something untouched, lying exactly where some old frime, brittle records had once claimed a queen had been buried. Anne Neville. They didn't know. But they wondered. The abbey's records from the 16th century had placed her there, near the south door to St. Edward's Chapel. It said the most sacred spot in the entire church, where kings had knelt in awe and saints had once walked. The body had been laid there in March of 1485. The funeral, while not grand, had been solemn and sincere. Richard had paid for it with royal funds, over £400, a small fortune. There had been candles, prayers, choirboys, incense. He had mourned her in public, even as the court whispered that he had poisoned her, even as the crown shifted beneath his feet. But after Richard's fall, no one had cared to remember where she lay. The new king had no interest in honoring her. Her name did not serve his legacy, and so her grave had been allowed to slip away, swallowed by dust, forgotten even by the abbey that had once buried her. Until now, as the workers cleared the soil around the coffin, and debate began to simmer. The burial had been undisturbed, the lead unbroken. Could it be her? Had the queen who vanished finally been found? But then another name was raised. Anne of Cleves, the discarded fourth wife of Henry VIII, had also been buried in the abbey, in a modest grave with no grand tomb. Her coffin was also lead, also without inscription. Could this be her instead? The Victorians loved a mystery, but they loved an answer more. They wanted to open it. There was talk not in public, but behind doors, in dusty rooms filled with relics and reverence, about lifting the lid, about confirming the identity, about unlocking a story left unfinished for nearly 400 years. The curiosity was not cruel. They spoke of it in the name of history, of scholarship, of truth. But beneath those words, something colder moved, the same hunger that had led them to open other royal coffins, to measure skulls and sketch remains, to claim pieces of the dead, as if knowledge could be carved from bone. But this coffin stayed closed. No one knows exactly why. Perhaps it was hesitation, perhaps uncertainty, perhaps the quiet weight of the abbey itself, the walls murmuring that this was not a vault to be pried open for spectacle. Or perhaps it was the silence of the Queen herself, resisting even in death. Whatever the reason, the moment passed. The coffin was left untouched, covered again, buried again, its occupant unnamed, but not unloved. They placed no new marker above it. They issued no proclamation. But in time, someone remembered. In 1960, nearly 100 years after that near discovery, a small plaque was placed on the wall of the South Ambulatory. It bore her name, Anne Neville, Queen to Richard III, and a brief description that tried by sea. Gently, to make amends, it spoke of her grace, her beauty, her place, but it could not confirm that she lay beneath. The plaque is only a suggestion, a guess shaped in brass. The coffin itself remains a mystery. No one has ever opened it. No one knows for certain who lies inside. But if it is her, and many believe it is, then Anne Neville, in a strange twist of fate, may be among the best preserved royals in English history. The lead, unbreached, would have protected her body from air and insects, from water and rot, wrapped in cerecloth, soaked in wax and resin, laid gently in robes of velvet or silk, crowned perhaps in thin gold. She may still resemble the girl who once stood beneath the arches of Westminster and was anointed queen beside a man history would not forgive. Her hands may still be folded. Her face may still carry the shape of youth. Her body, untouched by centuries of war and weather, may still bear the silence she took with her. But perhaps the truest miracle is that no one opened it, that in an age obsessed with knowing, someone somewhere chose to wonder instead, to let the coffin be, to let the mystery breathe, because there is power in not knowing, in imagining the Queen as she was young, pale, grieving, luminous, tragic, in not breaking the seal, in letting her rest in the only peace the world ever offered her. Perhaps to open it would be to reduce her once more from woman to object, from memory to measurement. Perhaps this is the only place where Anne Neville was ever safe. They almost opened it, but they didn't. And so she waits still in silence, in shadow, in the hollow where the crown once touched her brow. And in doing so, she teaches something the stone-cold kings around her never could, that sometimes the truest legacy is not in what is carved, or written, or unearthed. It is in what we choose to leave untouched. She has no tomb, no statue, no likeness etched in marble. Her name is missing from the grand plaques that decorate the chapels of kings. She left no heirs to carry her blood, no poets to sing her grief, no kingdom to mourn her when she was gone. And yet, She remains. In the breath between candlelight and silence, in the hush of old stones that remember even when the world forgets, in the shadow behind a crown that fell, Anne Neville was not meant to be remembered, not by history's design, not by the men who came after. She had been a bride of convenience, a pawn in games, not of her making, a queen who reigned for less than 2 years, and died too young to shape the world around her. Others had des voix, longer reigns, children who built legacies out of names. Anne had none of that. Only a crown that did not protect her. Only a child who died before he could become more than hope. Only a husband who, for all his power, could not save her, and perhaps, in the end, did not try. And yet, vive centurie la terre. We are still looking for her. Still whispering her name in the abbey that once tried to bury it. Still wondering whether the lead coffin they dared not open holds the woman who lived in shadows but refused to vanish completely. Still drawn to the question, how can someone be so forgotten and still feel so present? Perhaps it is because Anne Neville carries within her the quiet truth of so many women. History misplaces women, whose names were written in margins, whose portraits were never painted, whose deaths were not mourned with grandeur, but whose lives passed through the great chapters of kings and wars like threads of silk trailing behind iron. She was born into noise, the clash of Lancaster and York, the rise and fall of empires, the ambition of fathers and the arrogance of kings. But she moved through that noise gently. A girl turned, bride turned widow, turned queen, surviving one wave after another, never raising her voice, never sizing power, simply enduring. And maybe that is why she still holds us. Because Anne Neville was not a conqueror or a scandal, not a heroine or a villain, but a presence, a reminder that not all queens ruled, but some still mattered, that not all voices needed to shout to be heard, that not all stories are told in stone. There is a tenderness in her silence, not submission, and not defeat, but a kind of stillness that feels older than kingdoms, the stillness of someone who knew how easily thrones turn to ruin, how quickly power slips from hands that think it will last forever. She had watched her father die trying to play kingmaker, watched her first husband slaughtered in the dirt of a lost cause, watched her son fade from her arms, watched her husband crowned, and then broken. And when it was her time to leave, she did so without spectacle. No final speech. No recorded last words. Only a quiet death on the day of an eclipse, as if the sun itself dimmed to mark her going. She could have disappeared there. So many others have. But Anne didn't. Instead, her absence grew larger. The lack of a tomb became louder than a monument. The mystery of her grave more enduring than a shrine. She became the queen without a place, and that made her unforgettable. Because in the abbey, surrounded by kings whose names are carved in Latin and wrapped in marble robes, there is a space that does not speak, a space that makes you pause, and in that pause, she lives. There is a kind of quiet justice in that Anne Neville, the girl who was lost in her sister's house, who was hidden from the court, who was passed between political hands like a parchment, with no voice, now haunts the most sacred corner of England's royal heart. Not as a ghost of vengeance, not as a figure of fear, but as something gentler, something slower, a soft resistance to the noise of legacy, a stillness that asks us not to look for crowns or titles, but for the person beneath. What do we see? If we look closely, not the queen, not the wife, not the shadow of Richard's crown, but the girl who never got to grow old, the girl who loved her son more than power, the girl who walked into Westminster on a summer morning, and was crowned beside a man who might have loved her, or might have used her, or both. The girl whose name survived, not because anyone tried to preserve it, but because it refused to leave. She does not need her coffin opened. She does not need her body measured, or her robes described. She does not need marble. Because she has this, the quiet place in the story, where something human rests. Something fragile. Something real. And if you ever find yourself standing in Westminster Abbey, and you pause near the south side of the sanctuary, near the door to Edward the Confessor's chapel, you may not see her name. You may not feel her presence in the stone. But if you listen just for a moment in the hush between footsteps, in the echo of history's breath, you might hear what they tried to bury. The queen who refused to stay gone. The girl who endured every silence they gave her. And in the end, became louder than all of them.